Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, I can hear you.
Morning, Sven.
Hey, Milena, can you hear me?
Can hear you okay. Yes. We're not on our own, are we? There's other people already. Okay. I can see you. If assuming that's your presentation, I can see that as well. So that's good. I'm going to practice to get my presentation up just for 1 sec. I hope that's okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you? I'm just testing my presentation. Can you see what I've put on screen?
Um, I can't
Yes.
hear you.
Oh, no.
So
You
I
can see
think you
me,
said
but not the screen.
yes, that you could hear me.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
can hear both of you.
Cool. Okay, that's reassuring. Can
Yeah.
anybody see what I'm trying to present?
Yes, I can see it as well.
Okay, brilliant. So that works. Then I'll take it back down.
So can you hear me now?
I can hear you, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sven? Yeah, okay. Oh, now I can also hear you. So that's good. That
Good.
helps.
Hello, Katrina.
Hello.
Hi. Um, Let me try to. I shared my screen before. I'm not sure whether it worked.
I saw something that looked very complicated.
Yeah.
Your presentation.
Yeah.
Do you see it now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and actually
Okay.
this is quite nice because this time I can. Oh, okay. So when you present yourself, you can't see anything but the presentation, but when somebody else shares, you can see the faces and the presentation.
But actually, I do see you and I
Oh,
see
okay.
myself.
Okay, then you're on a version that's better than mine.
You can
Um,
actually hover your mouse on the bottom left, and you'll be able to see the one speaking and the presentation on the right as well.
Okay.
let
I'm
me go
I'm
back.
again on the web. I'm on the web browser, so I'm not sure that quite
Ah,
works
all
for me. But
right.
it's fine as long as I see my
Okay.
presentation when I need to speak. That's good, and I can see everything else.
Okay, so good. Then sharing the screen works. Let me finish this. Oops.
And for questions, people are going to put them in the. I'm just looking for the Q&A to see if I can see a Q&A.
Good. This will
I can see
be.
a chat, but I can't see a Q&A. Katrina, is that how it works? People put the questions in the chat, or is there a
Yes.
Q&A section somewhere? No.
Oh, no, that's the only one. Yeah.
Okay.
You only
So
have.
anything you type in there, everybody can see automatically.
Yes. They
Okay.
could also raise their hands in case they have questions. Yeah. But maybe I
Um,
can tell them how to do it.
That'd be good,
and
maybe at the
can
start. Yeah.
they unmute?
Yes, they can
participants?
also unmute. Yes, they can also unmute. And I can also mute them in case that, yeah, they are talking while somebody's also talking. Thanks, Vin.
Yes, when I'm not sure your connection is too
Yeah,
good,
oh,
you
there.
mute every now and then. Gone.
Internet connection.
You're back.
Sorry? Yeah, I'm back.
You were
Okay.
gone there for a second, but we've got you back.
Yeah, I probably need to find a different room. Okay. So my my question was because yesterday during
Quite choppy on my side.
the
Oh, I
We
think we
can't
lost
hear.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think Katrina, what he was trying to say is that we did a session on a different topic yesterday at the Asian Evaluation Week, and we had people abuse the question and answer function.
All right.
And one of the organizers had to come in and cut that off. So I think he was going to ask if there is a way that you can either mute people or cut them off if there's a disturbance.
Yes, I
I'm
could.
guessing
Yes.
that's what he was going to say. I don't know.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Yeah, I have. Yes, I do have the power
Okay.
to do that. Yeah.
We hope it doesn't happen again, but
All right.
just in case.
Okay.
Okay, I'm guessing he's looking for somewhere with a better connection. I'll mute myself for now and wait.
All right. Me too, and mute my video as well.
We can see you again, Sven.
Good. Can you also hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So I'm sitting outside now. So hopefully it won't be too noisy, but should be okay.
Okay, I was fooled by your background.
Yeah.
Thought you were still in the same room.
Oh yeah. Virtual backgrounds are quite helpful sometimes. Okay. So at least now I'm sitting very close
I
to.
was checking with Katrina. She can mute and tell people to stop chatting and things and disable them if needs be.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think the same will happen as yesterday, but you never know. Okay. Let me just start sharing the. Well, Katrina, what will people see if I start sharing my screen already? Will they see also the presenters?
Yes, they could see the presenters as well when they hover their mouse on the left side of the screen. You would see that there's a gallery view, people view like that, and then yeah, for example, okay, do you see on your left screen, lower left screen, this like tab? There's, and then you click on content and people. You just adjust it to the right, to the left, and then you'll be able to find yourself, or you'll be able to see the speaker, the
Okay.
people also. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so Milena, what do you think about the order? So let's. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
I think you're on mute, Milena.
Lovely. Still doing it. Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense to me. And if Andreas doesn't arrive in time for his slots, then we'll just turn it. I guess I can then follow on, but it sounded as if he should be there, right?
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, Katrina, since the keynote is going on until now, right? We probably
Yeah.
should start a few minutes later, is that so that people
Yeah, around.
can switch over?
Yeah. Yes, you can, yeah. But you have to make sure that the time will be just right so you finish it, because I
Yeah.
know that your session is only until 11:30.
Yeah. Oh, that's fine.
Okay.
Valerie not here yet, is she?
No. I can send her a quick message. I think we had like 30 something people who registered.
I haven't even checked. That's good. That's good to know.
Yeah. Oh, there's Valerie.
Hello, everyone.
Wow, that's loud. Okay.
Oh, really? Sorry.
Oh, better too loud than not. Okay, great. No, I just sent you a message. Wondering whether you had some technical issues, but seems all good.
Ah, I can see Andreas. Full house.
Oh, wow.
Hello, friends.
Right
Oh
on
God.
time.
Sorry, I just jumped out from one to the next meeting. I feel a little bit juggled, to be honest. Not sure what I'm going to do now.
You're gonna talk about evidence and gap maps, or evidence gap maps, whatever you like to call it.
Yeah,
Okay.
guys, you want me to go last? I'm happy to go last, to be honest.
Well, actually,
Acclimatizing. No,
well,
go ahead.
I'm gonna go first anyway. I'm
Okay.
afraid, and so last time you made some really important clarifications or additions to my presentation. So if it's okay for you, I would
Sure.
actually prefer if you come second.
Okay. No
For
problem.
instance, I'm gonna mention that because framework just briefly, and I'm not gonna really talk too much in detail, or I'm not gonna talk at all about sort of the selection process, how you come from, you know, the broad population of studies to
Yeah.
then your final selection. So, and I do think that you did explain it really well last time.
Okay. Thanks. No problem. Should work.
Great. Wow, a lot of work happened in the background compared to yesterday, or is it a different
Yeah.
room? No, it's not a different room.
No, it's the same room. These are the recommendations for the private sector evaluation. Can you see them? So it's basically, I'm sorry, but it's true. They are the recommendations. So we've just been writing them up to see and check if we all agree with that. So I got this glass wall here in the back in the office, and basically everyone can come in and scratch it out and change things and put something else. Pretty
Nice.
easy.
Cool. However, I mean, we do have now the ambition to stay under 10 recommendations and have them relatively short. That looks a bit more.
We have 18, but we're trying to put it down to 10. Yeah, you're right. We're gonna scratch off some that we don't like the very last day before submission. That's the plan at least.
Okay, great. So, Katrina, are you gonna kick us off once we're live?
Yeah. Hi, Sven. Are you starting now? All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. So welcome to this session. So for the participants, we just would like to remind you to keep your mics on mute, and you can see you can see everyone else using the bottom on your lower left screen. There's a gallery view, the speaker view, and people view, and enjoy the session today. That's all.
Okay, great. So I see we have about 23 participants right now. However, I would say we slowly get started. Perhaps some people gonna move over from the keynote speech, and we'll have some more once we go along. But let's get going because we've got some really interesting program for you today. We're going to explain and show you some examples of evidence and gap maps, or evidence gap maps, depending on where sort of you're from, which we think is a great tool for evaluators to find and map out evidence and see also where there's gap of evidence. In our experience, it's really helpful when you're newly working on a topic, and if you really want to see, okay, where do I want to focus my evaluation on? What kind of evidence is out there? Do I perhaps want to do a review of existing studies, or is there scope, for instance, to do an impact evaluation in one of the fields where perhaps there's none? So it's a really useful tool when you start working on a topic. We'll show you a bit more in a second. I'm here joined with some really esteemed and dear colleagues of mine. I'm going to introduce them to you just before they get started, so you know much better who's talking then, and don't forget it when I if I would do it right now. Since I'm going to start, I'm going to introduce myself really briefly. My name is Sven Harten. I'm Deputy Director of DEVAL, which is the German Development Evaluation Institute. So basically, we do look at Germany's development cooperation and have the mandate to evaluate them. So I've been around doing evaluations for quite some time, and I'm going to kick off this session and start sharing my screen with a broad overview on evidence gap maps. Then my colleagues later on will give you more sort of details and more meat or tofu if you want. Okay, so let's get started. So basically, really, this is an overview how they look like. Some I think quite interesting examples how diverse evidence gap maps can be, and also pointing to some limitations and recommendations if you would start doing this. So basically, again, what is an evidence gap map? Basically, it is a map which usually is sort of in a nice visual representation of existing studies. So depending on your choice, it could be systematic reviews, impact evaluations in a sector. Sometimes it's broadened to do also some perhaps not so rigorous evaluations in the sector, but mostly it's rigorous impact evaluations, and then sort of on a higher level systematic reviews, or sometimes you even have evidence gap maps in there. And typically it's presented by types of interventions and then the outcomes. So you'll see it on the left-hand side of the screen, sort of some ideas how that could look like, and basically also you see where you have evidence and where you have the gaps. So again, why would you do this, right? Basically, as evaluators in this time and age, there's so much evidence out there. And evidence gap maps is really an important tool in our opinion, not to reinvent the wheel, not to do a costly RCT or other kind of impact evaluation in a field where you already have tons of RCTs or other rigorous impact evaluations out there. So in the time of scarce resources, it helps you to direct your resources to those areas where we really have gaps in evidence and where we as evaluators want to contribute to closing those gaps. And that evidence gap map shows that it's user-friendly. It's also a great tool for research institutes, for policymakers who want to sort of come up with a learning agenda for the next couple of years. And it really helps to show in a very systematic way the field. So here basically well, this is what I already said, but the point is, again, evidence is often scattered around different websites. You have gray literature, you have different databases like Scopus, for instance, or Web of Science, and evidence gap maps brings together this information that you find all over the place. And where do we locate them? Sort of in the space of evidence synthesis. So if you are aware, apart from individual studies, right now, due to the work, owing to the work of 3IE or Campbell collaboration and others, more and more projects are going on to bring together the different individual studies. So the most well known from Campbell collaboration, for instance, or Cochrane, is a systematic review. So for instance, right now you read a lot about systematic reviews in the field of vaccines, for instance, where they look at literally hundreds of RCTs and bringing together the evidence from all those primary studies. And what is important about the systematic review is that the basis is primary studies, and in a systematic review, they will also tell you about sort of the content of the results, what all those different RCTs found, and they will sort of highlight sort of common threads, common results from all those primary studies. And sometimes, especially in the field of pharmaceuticals, you already have so many systematic reviews that sometimes it makes sense to do a review of reviews. So that's a little bit a higher level. But then next is an evidence and gap map, which includes those systematic reviews and the primary studies, mapping that all out. And sometimes, as I said, you already have so many systematic reviews and evidence gap maps that you might even want to do a mega map, which includes systematic reviews. So the important thing to remember for all of you who might not have heard so much about evidence and gap maps is it's sort of the first level where we don't really know about the content of the studies. It's just a map that shows where evidence is and where it isn't. But in most cases, we don't really know what the evidence is that we have in that map. Now, there's some sort of visual interactive systems, especially by 3IE, where you can get direct links to the evidence, but usually in an evidence gap map, you don't see that, but you see that in a systematic review. So perhaps to make this a bit more concrete, there are tons of different ways of evidence gaps out there. For instance, one also courtesy of Howard White. This is an example from Sightsavers. You have an evidence gap map, and what is specific about this one here, it focuses on the strength of evidence on the y-axis. You see strong, inconclusive, and weak, and the colored bottoms, they stand for the quality of the review. So they don't really show you much about the type of studies and other things, but they really show quite nicely where you have strong evidence or weak evidence and how good the review was. Not the most common type, but one that you might want to be aware of. And of course, you can make it as complicated and complex as you want. So here, an evidence-based policing matrix, which is even three-dimensional. So perhaps a bit of an overload of information. But here on the x-axis, you see sort of the type or the scope of the target. So it's individuals or groups that policing intervention targeted, and you'll see obviously quite a lot of policing interventions target individuals. And then on the y-axis, the specificity of the prevention mechanism. So from general to focused. And then you have the sort of different types of buttons. It's different kind of results. So this is really much more about the content of those interventions, the type of interventions, less so about the quality of the evidence. And here is another one that presents again different kind of information that we haven't seen in the others. Sorry, you can't really see those balls, but basically what I just want to say, they show how much studies were there. So the size of the ball shows how many studies they found, how big the literature population was. However, we would say that there is quite a common approach that we think is quite useful, which is based on what 3IE and Campbell collaboration developed, and there it is. So on the y-axis, you have the sectors. In our case, this is, and we'll talk later a bit more about this. It's on climate change adaptation, and you have sort of the sectors of the intervention, perhaps the water sector on the y-axis, and then you have the subsectors. So on water, it could be technology, it could be nature-based options, and then up there on the x-axis, you'll see the outcome areas. So basically, you map out the studies by type of intervention, perhaps subsectors, and then the key outcome areas that those interventions are trying to achieve. And basically, this is sort of when you want to come up with an evidence gap map, there are a couple of key things that you need to design and decide upon up front, which is basically the PICOS framework. So first of all, what is the population that you study? What are the types of interventions? What are comparators? What are the outcomes? And what are study designs? But my colleagues will talk about this a bit more in detail. But basically, I would say a relatively useful type of map is this structure. And then when you fill this in, what you will see is here the different color codes stand for different types of studies. So it could be the blue is like a rigorous impact evaluation, an experimental or quasi-experimental design, and then you might want to show some systematic reviews, some evidence gap maps. So depending on your choice, you choose different colors and buttons, and then you'll see that some areas might be very populated with lots of studies, and others a bit less. Oops, something just went wrong. I'm sorry. Okay. I think there was an interactive map, and it wanted to open the link to those studies. Okay. Right. Sorry for that. So to wrap up, basically an evidence gap map, as I said, displays really nicely where the evidence is, but it is doesn't show you any content, right? There's no interpretation of results, and depending on how you choose it, usually you would define on a minimum standard of quality, often work with published studies. So there's a risk that you have a publication bias. There's a risk that some important studies are not selected, but in the end, you don't want to have some studies that are not too reliable in there. Sorry. Okay, some reflections. So basically, what is really critical, and you'll hear that from my colleagues, is how you define the intervention types and how you define the outcomes. Well, that's probably standard work for us as evaluators, but depending on how you choose your classifications, your evidence gap map could look really different. So it's really important to consult with your stakeholders and do different rounds of those of the framework and show it and test it again, so that everybody is really on board and you come up with a good framework. And then also what I would recommend, there's a lot of work, as you will hear later on, in finding those studies, screening them, coding them. You really need a good team of coders, of people who are doing the review, and you need to work closely together, train everybody in the team and ensure agreement, so that once people read abstracts, they classify them equally. So that's really important. So the upfront work, the conceptual work, coming up with the categories and then training them, ensuring an agreement with the coding is so important. And that is an evidence gap map in the end looks like nice and easy and simple, but there's a lot of work going in there, especially in the preparation phase, but then also going through the literature. So that's all from my side, and now let's get concrete with some examples. And enough talking from my side. I have now the pleasure to introduce to you my esteemed colleague Andreas Reumann. Andreas Reumann is the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. He's lots of experience in evaluation, in monitoring, working on many evidence gap maps in the past, obviously really focusing on everything that is covering the Green Climate Fund. So, Andreas, over to you.
Thank you, Sven. Let me just quickly move over to my screen. Colleagues, just let me do this in a quick way. You must be seeing my screen right now, huh? Yes.
Yes, we do.
Excellent. So thank you very much. Sven, once more, thank you very much for the introduction. And let me also wish you a very warm welcome here from the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. I'm calling today from Songdo in South Korea. So a warm welcome and good morning to everyone in Europe. So the IU, in partnership with our colleagues at DEVAL, had basically looked at the evidence in climate change adaptation, in the climate change adaptation space in low and middle income countries. To us, this is very important as it is provided by the GCF and its stakeholders with evidence-based evaluations, and this is an important part of our mandate here at the Green Climate Fund. And so for us, it's really important to know what we're learning from the operations from the GCF, but also it's important to learn what's happened out there globally and what's the current state of evidence. So you might want to ask us now, so what is evidence? And I believe my colleague Sven has already alluded to this, but basically from our perspective, evidence in a very brief definition would be the available body of facts indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or not. So as with many things, traditionally studies are always prone, and that is studies that provide evidence, are always prone to certain types of biases. And we had quickly heard of selection bias, publication bias, discussion bias, and other biases. So the evidence gap maps in itself for us are the thematic evidence collection that helps us to consolidate of what we know, what works, and for whom, and what doesn't in a particular area. So let me just briefly tell you here in the next slide of what we know. So from a study published in 2016 that was also based on FreeIE impact evaluation repository data, we know there's a promising trend. And a promising trend is that we have more and more impact evaluation done and published in recent years. And you see that in the top right corner in that graph that I show you here. And it's basically also telling us, in particular, theory-based impact evaluations were completed in Asia, Latin America, and East Africa. However, there are also gaps. And the gaps are that certain parts of the globe have not had that chance of rich evidence through impact evaluation. So larger parts of Africa, as well as the small island developing states and other areas, are not yet included in those rigorous impact evaluations. So then another aspect is obviously this question of thematic gaps. Right? Sorry, colleagues, could you just please mute yourself so we can listen into the conversation later on? So thanks for that. So on the lower right corner, you see basically a diagram that shows you over time what we know about climate change adaptation in the Web of Science. And here we just looked at by clearly putting in that keyword, looking at the evidence. And you see from 2008 to up to 2018, we have far more coming on in terms of knowledge and evidence when we look at climate change adaptation, which is good. It shows us also that before this, climate change adaptation was not really in vogue in the contemporary research arena. And that, again, it's been quite a surprise to us. But when we looked at the thematic gaps, we know that, when I will speak about this in a second, there are mostly 4 sectors that will look at strong and evidence-based impact evaluations, and it's mostly health, education, social protection, and agriculture. Why this is? Well, some may say these are sectors which are prominently known as sectors for impact assessments and impact evaluations. So more modern areas and different areas have not had that chance yet. And lastly, there's also a distributional gap. So there's a less deep distributional analysis done in it. So now moving on to the evidence gap map that we have here at hand. So we looked at, and this is really key, and Sven has already alluded to this, so that we based our approach on the PICOS framework. And the PICOS framework basically stands for population, intervention, comparator, outcome, and study design. So what did we ask ourselves? We asked ourselves here, what high quality evidence do we have for adaptation interventions? So again, and this is to what does it say about these interventions helping people in low and middle income countries to adapt to climate? So we had a very human-centric approach for adaptation. So in all, the population would look at that human-centric approach across all the different sectors in low and middle income countries, as the title says of this evidence gap map. The interventions would be anything that adjusts, reduce, stops, or benefits from any direct changes in climate, as well as climate hazards. The comparators would be anything else that's not climate adaptation interventions. The outcomes, again, are also very human-centric around the question of climate variability, extreme and incidences of climate hazard. And the studies here are mostly focused on experimental, quasi-experimental, as well as non-experimental studies, and systematic reviews being sort of the gold standard when it comes to evidence reviews. And I quickly move over to what we've done in this study. And Sven alluded to this, it's really important to train the staff that's working with you. So here I brought to you the flow diagram that's basically showing you of how we went about business when constituting this theory of change. So we looked at the data set, the Web of Science. We found, in a broadly speaking, on climate adaptation and a variety of different code words. We found about 9,956 studies and journal articles. We also looked at the gray literature, in particular from our colleagues at the German evaluation departments, as well as the GIZ and others, to see what the gray literature is showing us in those countries. We then looked at duplicates and removed anything that's more related to conferences, books, and so on and so forth. We found in total about 13,000 studies that are generally addressing the question that we're trying to look out for and trying to better understand. We then looked through a very rigorous screening process of the abstracts and titles on what would truly would truly be included into the study. We had to exclude several studies there, but the large exclusion happened during the process of full text screening. And here we came down to 908 articles and studies that were relevant for consideration. And then we went on to use the PICOS in addressing the inclusion and exclusion criteria, looking at study designs in particular, but also if there were true interventions that as described, followed our PICOS. And what we found in total were about 464 studies. So all in all, the thing that I want you to take away here is we found 464 studies. So this is a long way of saying something very, very evident. But again, this is this rigorous process that Sven was referring to. So let me now introduce to you a very cumbersome graph. This is basically the result of our hard work. This is the evidence gap map. So I don't want you to look at this in too much detail right now, but let me just highlight a couple of things. So as Sven was already highlighting, we basically here have a two-dimensional evidence gap map. On the left-hand side, you see all the interventions and groups on interventions. They are grouped according to different sectors. And then further to the sectors, there's also a grouping according to the different types of interventions. We repeated all these types of interventions for the reason of being able to look across the different sectors of what happens with the different types of interventions. And then we mapped those pairs of interventions against the outcomes. And that's basically on the top. You find all the different outcome groups, starting with uptake, going over to regressors and stressors, then adaptive capacity and enabling environment. Here we basically followed the UNFCCC definitions, but as well as the IPCC reports on vulnerability and the definitions on vulnerability and climate change adaptation. And we try to find a logic sequence of what is necessary, what are necessary outcomes for true climate change adaptation. I also should highlight here that we went on to only identify 4 sectors, and this happened basically in a stepwise approach. We looked at the sectors and result areas and themes that are used by other climate funds, such as the GEF and the Adaptation Fund. We also looked at the OECD to further identify how is the OECD thinking about climate change adaptation, as well as the GCF and DVAL, our esteemed partners here in this exercise. So what we found is we basically framed those sectors around the 4 sectors that you see here: water, land use, built environment, forestry, fishing, agriculture, society, economy, and health. So what you see from an evidence gap map is basically 2 things. You see the absolute gaps, so that's the empty spots, the white spots that you see there, and then you see also synthetic gaps. So the synthetic gaps are basically gaps where we don't have any systematic review. So basically, whenever you look at experimental and quasi-experimental design, you have an idea that there is strong evidence out there, but it's obviously not further synthesized to give you any kind of indication on are there positive correlations mostly or negative correlations mostly with regards to the pairs of interventions and outcomes. So luckily, and here are a couple of takeaways, what we found is that there are a couple of things that are coming out quite prominently. So in terms of the outcomes, the main studies, the main areas where we found studies, the main areas where we found studies are very obvious here. The ones that we didn't find anything is in the enabling environment. Because generally speaking, there's very little to be said about the political landscape in climate change adaptation on what works and what doesn't, and the absolute evidence that we have. I won't go into much detail, but let me just refer also to a couple of good learnings that we have from the study design. So we learned that most of the study designs were non-experimental studies. So the non-experimental studies account for about 50%, 49.7% of all studies that we found. Quasi-experimental studies are second with 27%, and the least common were the systematic reviews, with only 7.9% of the studies being systematic reviews. An aspect worth noting here is the fact that most evidence on institutional outcomes is addressed in systematic reviews. Right? So that's also an interesting finding here. And the highest degree of concentration of systematic reviews is found in respect to the effects of nature-based solutions, particularly in the agricultural sector, and you see that with the very dark colored areas in the middle of your screen. Okay, so what do I want you to take away from here? A couple of learnings. So a couple of gaps that we found here were we basically found extreme gaps in water and built environments. So there's a lack of evidence as of today. We found there's also gaps in the interventions that, across the different sectors. So we have several types of interventions that have very little evidence across the different sectors. So that's also interesting. So for instance, technological options were one of those concerns. We've also got absolute gaps in the institutional systems, as I said, the policy area where we don't know much. And lastly, I should also mention that we're very surprised at finding a lot of gaps in exposure. So the exposure to risks and how this would be managed, which was one of the outcome areas, was there. On the upside, we had a concentration of evidence around the sector of agriculture, and in terms of interventions, in particular on conservation efforts in agriculture, irrigation, and extension services. In terms of the outcomes, again, the outcomes, the top level that you see here, we found a high concentration on adoption studies and economic benefits. So that means the evidence is rather rich in this regard. So let me just come to the next slide if it works. Here we go. So one interesting takeaway here from our studies should be this one. So what you see here, while evidence gap maps identify both the evidence and the gaps in the evidence base, it doesn't identify the financial volume or the number of projects and investments that are currently implemented. So one innovation that we want to bring forward here as DeVal and IEU is this work of an adjacent intervention heat map, as we call it. So an intervention heat map is basically a systematic comparison of the intervention portfolios undertaken by or with different funds from development organizations. and they are basically mapped one-on-one to the same areas of evidence in the evidence gap maps. So this is to provide substantive insights on the portfolio development, and should be given high priority when speaking to decision makers and planners to determine if the investment and adaptation in their portfolio is operating on an evidence scarce environment or an evidence rich environment. So an evidence scarce environment is obviously the fields where there's little to no evidence available, and evidence rich environment, vice versa, where there's a large body of evidence. So again, to not indulge you too much into this entire map, I'll give you the takeaways right away. So what's interesting for an intervention heat map here is that for policymakers, this is the opportunity to, and could be interesting, to operating in either an evidence-rich or an evidence-scarce environment, depending the question. And here, again, important to say, this depends on the risk appetite of the investor, but also on the priorities set by the investor. So one investor could put the priority on the generation of new evidence, so providing additional rigorous impact evaluations. So then this map could definitely help. Another might be interested in synthesizing existing evidence to truly find out what works and how does it work in a positive notion or a negative notion. What do we know? And that could again be a very interesting map for such an investor as well. Also interesting to take away here is that sectors such as built environment, water, and policy, where we didn't find enough evidence for now, are also traditionally deemed as not being very suitable for impact evaluations. So, given an example, for instance, you may not be able to find a counterfactual for policy implementation because you don't have the same country with the same policy elements to compare it to. And then also, in an example for built environments, there are many different interventions that are interlinked. The complexity of a sector can be quite cumbersome when you try to assign a single outcome to a certain intervention. So this is something to definitely take away here as well. And then lastly, there's also a high weight in 4 sectors in terms of the interventions. So here, just to name informational and educational intervention types could be something interesting for the future. So all in all, this intervention heat map can really help to expand on the global evidence by facilitating these future evidence-based programming and development efforts and giving greater clarity to those that want to invest in climate change adaptation. Let me just, before I end, and I'm sorry to take a little bit longer, let me just quickly bring the learnings. So all in all, what I've been saying to you today is, what do we learn? We learned we have more evidence than before, but unfortunately it's not enough. We have geographical differences, so areas such as the sub-Saharan African studies are there much more, so that a lot of investment has happened there, but Latin America, for instance, is not as well informed. We have differences in sectors, so the agricultural sector is usually quite well equipped in terms of impact and rigorous impact evaluations. Water, however, is an important sector for the future, as well as health, struggle on certain levels. What could be done? Well, if you ask me as an evaluator and a researcher at heart, more studies could be done, in particular in water and land-based ecosystems. More impact evaluations are needed for water interventions. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis should be done in areas like adoption studies in agriculture to systematically look at the rich body of evidence that we've got. And lastly, for policymakers and implications for those that are in the decision-making business, well, there's ample evidence for agriculture, ample evidence for adoption studies. Please look at them through evidence gap maps and decide based on them. Be more evidence-based. And then overlay with financial flows, there could be this policy direction for new evidence or synthesizing evidence. So far more targeted involvement in terms of investments could be a way forward. And lastly, synthesis gaps could be and synthetic gaps. Apologies for the typo here. Could be analyzed through meta-analysis, and I'm glad to share with you DeVal and IU have already completed several of these meta-analyses, and so very welcome to look on our website for further information. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Andreas, for this great overview and also some really important additions to the general topic of what evidence gap maps are. So, dear audience, just a quick reminder that if you have questions, please put them into the chat. David, I saw yours. We're gonna respond to this at the end of the session, but please, everybody, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, so don't be shy and ask your questions in the chat. So next up is my esteemed colleague Milena. Milena is a senior evaluator at the European Investment Bank, specifically, of course, there in the evaluation division. She's the climate change focal point, and most recently worked on an evaluation on climate change adaptation that is soon to come out, and she also has lots of experience in monitoring and evaluation as an advisor for the UK government and also for the European Commission. So without further ado, Milena, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. I'm hoping my screen is being shared and everybody can see the first slide, the evidence gap map of energy efficiency.
Yes.
Does that work? Okay, brilliant. All right. So this is the evidence gap map that we recently, last year, worked on in the European Investment Bank. The evidence gap map was part of a package and something that we called a systematic evidence review. So it was a combination of a mapping exercise, mapping of evidence, and then followed by synthesizing a subset of the evidence that we identified on the map. So we've proceeded in two distinct phases. So initially we collected and mapped existing evidence on the effectiveness of energy efficiency interventions. And then once we had the map and we could see the gaps, and I will talk you through that in a moment, in phase two, we then identified an area of interest to the European Investment Bank, where we saw that there was sufficient primary evidence that hadn't yet been synthesized, and where we would then go ahead and do a systematic review. And the area we identified there were residential energy efficiency intervention. Why did we decide to start with the evidence map, and why didn't we go immediately for a systematic review and start from there and in a way save ourselves some time? The reason behind that decision was that we weren't really sure what evidence was out there, and that we felt it would be useful to gather all the evidence to then help us inform the topic of the systematic review that we'd be doing next. But also more generally, we felt that a map would be a useful source, not just for us, but for a larger audience interested in the topic. And the thinking was that by systematically searching for the evidence, and again, we searched through published and unpublished studies, so the grey evidence as well, and gathering all of that in one place, we felt would make it more accessible and further down the line, avoid duplication of research and really make publicly available what is out there already. But from a more selfish perspective, mapping the evidence first for us was a kind of insurance policy, really, in that this way we knew upfront that we would have enough primary evidence to synthesize, and that we wouldn't end up a year into the project with an empty systematic review that would really simply just tell us that we didn't know what works, and we didn't know what didn't work, and that more research had to take place. So that's why we took this two-step approach. So the evidence map that we produced covered interventions of energy efficiency measures at the level of households, public institutions, businesses, and industry. And we specifically focused on measures aimed at improving energy efficiency of residential, public, and commercial buildings, but also investments in production processes and more energy efficient equipment or machinery in small and medium-sized enterprises, but also in industry. Then the diagram on the right-hand side there shows you a little bit the sort of definitions that we used when we tried to organize the evidence that was out there. So the blue boxes are the three overarching intervention areas that we used. So first one are policy measures, and what we've included there are things like disclosure policies or codes and standards. We then also included financial assistance, and there we've got things like subsidies or monetary incentives. And then the third box, information and technical capacity, where you've got, for example, energy audits or technical assistance, but also education and campaign. Outcomes, we looked at socioeconomic outcomes, at energy outcomes, but also more intermediate outcomes such as behavioral change, and environmental outcome. The PICOs that Andreas has already introduced you to, here are the ones that we used for this evidence gap map. So I've already said we included households, public institutions, businesses, and industry. And we didn't impose any geographic restrictions, so evidence from the world was allowed to be included in the map. We included interventions that facilitated the uptake of energy efficient services or technologies. Outcomes, I've already mentioned, energy, environmental, socioeconomic, and behavioral change outcomes. And finally, we focused on experimental and quasi-experimental studies. So unlike the example that Andreas took us through, we didn't map non-experimental evidence here. Time-wise, we set a cutoff point at 2000 and disallowed any studies that were older than that. The logic behind this was that we felt that any technologies older than 20 years, things will probably have moved on, and learning from that wouldn't be so useful at this point in time. Then I've got a snapshot of a map. You've seen similar ones already now. So we ended up with just under 300 studies on this map. They're all impact evaluations, experimental or quasi-experimental. The colors on the map are the systematic reviews. So we did find 16 systematic reviews. And those we assessed the quality of the reviews, and the colors are showing that most of them were felt to be, or we had low confidence in the quality. There's a few medium confidence ones, but there weren't any high confidence systematic reviews that we identified. The grey dots are the impact evaluations, and I think Sven has already noted, the bigger the dots, the more studies we found for that sort of intervention and outcome. The map can be found on the 3IE website. It has been published earlier this year already. When it comes to the evidence gaps that we identified with this map, so we found that evidence when it comes to impact evaluations has certainly increased a lot over the last 20 years. We also found that most of the studies came from high income studies, very little from developing countries. which I guess kind of makes sense because most of the interventions when it comes to energy efficiency do take place in high-income countries. We found that despite more evidence becoming available, there were still some gaps. And when it comes to interventions, the gaps were around capacity building, technical assistance, bank lending, but also home appliance credit. For outcomes, we found that there were only a relatively small number of studies which looked at socioeconomic outcomes, so for example, income savings or job creation. For energy and environmental outcomes that went beyond energy use, again, there wasn't a lot. So not a lot of studies that looked at, for example, greenhouse gas emissions or air pollution. And then the population, we found that most evidence was at the household level, and there was only limited evidence at the business, industry, and public institution level. Synthesis gaps, we identified several clusters of primary studies when it came to monitoring and displaying energy consumption, provision of energy efficient technologies, energy pricing initiatives, but also for education and campaigns. And those hadn't yet been synthesized, or certainly not synthesized in high quality systematic review. I will move on a little bit from the sort of topic area of energy efficiency and what we found on the map to really think about the experience on doing an evidence gap map. And this was the first evidence gap map that we had conducted in the European Investment Bank. So when it came to user engagement, our initial discussion point with our intended users was right at the beginning of the project, where we had several discussions on possible topics for the evidence review. And we started off with saying we want to do something in the field of climate action. But of course, that's way too big to then do a map climate action. So we had discussions with colleagues wanting to make sure that whatever area we decide on, we've got their buy-in and that it's useful for them. Proposals they came up with were specifically in areas which are newer, where there was much more appetite to sort of learn on them. So circular economy was one of them, where we had to then say, sorry, but that won't work. There simply isn't enough solid evidence. There aren't enough impact evaluations for that field out there yet to make that a worthwhile exercise, especially knowing that we would like to go forward and do a systematic review. Adaptation was another topic that came up where we pushed back, saying there's a couple of other efforts going on that, and we don't want to duplicate that. So I'm glad to see there's a map out there now that we can maybe share with our colleagues. So we decided on energy efficiency. And that really led us to the second interaction with our intended users when we came to the PICOs, and when we said that we really wanted to focus on the effectiveness and counterfactual evidence. That again wasn't easy to explain to colleagues, and there was a lot of interest in the sort of more input or possibly output type level rather than outcomes and impact. Nonetheless, we went with impact evaluations, we went with counterfactual evidence, and we went ahead and mapped what was out there. So the sort of final step of our interaction with our users was around the dissemination of the findings from the map. And we found really that there was limited interest from operational staff when we shared the map with them, and that we got most traction from researchers, from evaluation colleagues, which found the map more interesting, and the operational colleagues really saw it mainly as a stepping stone for the system. Then one final slide from me in terms of some early lessons, really. So I said this was the first time we did an evidence map. And what are we taking away from this experience? I would say that the first lesson really is that building an understanding of evidence maps and what they are and how they can be useful does take some time. So us coming afresh to this, it was a little bit of a struggle. It was a learning experience for us in the evaluation division, but also when it came to communicating about evidence gap maps to colleagues. Then secondly, we found that because it is a very systematic exercise, a very structured exercise, producing evidence gap maps does take time. The same way that producing systematic reviews takes time. And I guess it's true to say that we hadn't quite realized how long this would take us. So we spent roughly a year on the evidence gap map, and we're coming up to a year more or less on the systematic review now, which is just completing its peer review process. Then thirdly, we found that the map as a standalone product, as I've said just now, was really of most use to researchers and evaluators. And I guess this sort of echoes what Sven was saying at the start. It's useful to inform what you might want to do going forward in terms of research, but it's been difficult to make it interesting to the more operational colleagues. And this may have been different had we actually had the resources to add a short summary of each study that we included on the map, or even to assess the quality of the primary studies we included on the map, especially maybe the ones that came from the grey literature and which weren't published in journals. But as it was, we had a map that had links to the actual studies, but without a description of the findings or an assessment of the quality there, although we did assess the systematic reviews, did provide summaries for that. What did work quite well for us was to have a sort of adaptable user group within the European Investment Bank. So we started off with quite a large group of colleagues when we were discussing the topic of the evidence map, and then we reduced it to a much more smaller and focused group when it came to conducting the systematic review, where there were colleagues that really knew the topic area and could help us with feedback on that. That is my presentation. Thank you very much. And back over to Sven.
Thank you, Milena, and thank you for sharing those really interesting and important points about stakeholder engagement and also the challenges and sort of ideas for overcoming some of them. Just to complement, I think one point that also helps to make an evidence gap map interesting for stakeholders is what Andreas has been showing, right? The heat map. So, but then again, as you rightly said, Milena, it takes already a lot of time and resources to do an evidence gap map, and then where to find the additional resources for more work. For that, and so the next speaker is my esteemed colleague Valerie Hubble. Valerie is a team leader at DeWaal, and she's a psychologist by background. Spent some time at the World Food Program in the past, and worked at DeWaal on an evaluation on blended finance, and currently is working on a synthesis evaluation on the cooperation with the private sector in development cooperation. So Valerie, over to you. And please, colleagues, in the chat, we saw the question on which studies to select, and what about qualitative methods. Those are great questions, and we'll get to them in the end.
Thank you, Sven. Hopefully you can already see my presentation now.
Yes.
Yes, so as Sven mentioned, I'm going to talk about an evidence gap map on blended finance interventions. we conducted last year at DEVA. So just in case you might not know what blended finance is all about, I just want to mention that it's the strategic use of concessional finance to mobilize private finance for sustainable development. And I think this will become more clear when we look at the next slide, which, okay. So this is a little bit different to the EGMs that we saw before, because we actually decided to construct a theory of change before starting with the EGM, and we found this to be quite useful for just clarifying what the different categories are, and also what the different outcomes would be that we might look at or that we might find in the studies that the EGM is based on. So here you can see the different categories of blended finance. So for example, there are guarantees or insurance or grants that are all used by, for example, development finance institutions to lower the risk for private investors to invest more in sustainable development projects. And then we see that this is linked to different outputs, which are then linked to different outcomes and impacts. And these are in different categories, such as financial additionality, so mobilizing more private finance, but also development additionality, market development, and also sector effects. So quite a range of different categories that we looked at with this theory of change, and that were included in the EGM at the end. And this led us to the inclusion criteria. So this is actually quite similar to the inclusion criteria we saw before. So it's also following the PICOS, except that we changed outcomes to effects so that we could also include outputs as well as outcomes, because some of the outputs are actually quite crucial to blended finance. So financial additionality in particular is a very important aspect that is more like on the output level. So we looked at individuals, groups, institutions, and sectors in low to middle income countries. And in terms of the intervention, that's what I mentioned before. So this is the official OECD definition of blended finance. So strategic use of development finance for the mobilization of additional finance towards sustainable development in developing countries. And in terms of comparisons, the studies might have included similar programs without blended finance or modeled financial projections. And so the effects I've already mentioned before. And in terms of the study designs, we looked at some studies that was a little bit different to the EGMs that my colleagues mentioned before or explained before. And this also can maybe already respond to some of the questions I saw in the chat, because we actually did not just include quantitative studies or systematic reviews. So the reason for this is that we anticipated, based on our previous work on blended finance, that there would be a very low number of studies that meet the most rigorous criteria of study designs. So in terms of quantitative studies, we expected that there would be very limited evidence. And we thought it'd be more useful to include a broader range of different studies, while still also having some basic requirements, such as specifically addressing additionality. So they might not have used always counterfactuals as such, but at the very least, they must have looked at what the intervention might have been like without the blended finance component, for example. So this is like a basic requirements, and we did exclude evaluations that were just simple program like monitoring reports, for example. Right, and in addition to broadening the study design, we also made sure, as you will see, that we included in the EGM the strength of the evidence, so that we would see not only where the evidence is focused on, but also where the more rigorous evidence is. So here you can see the EGM that we produced. So we have the different types of instruments on the y-axis, And then on the x-axis, we have the different categories of effects. At the top and at the bottom, we have the different, like, more specific types of effects. And the bubbles obviously show the number of, or the evidence that we found, and the color shows how rigorous the evidence was. So the lighter the color, the more rigorous the evidence we found. So like experimental or quasi-experimental studies would be in light blue, and dark blue would be more program evaluations. So just to point out a few things, I think it's very obvious from first glance that there's quite limited evidence in general, so not many studies. We actually only found 33 studies to include in the EGM, so there's really very limited evidence on blended finance out there. And most of this is towards the darker blue side, so mostly from gray literature, from program evaluation report, and there was very limited rigorous evidence on blended finance. And when we look at the different instruments, we can also see like very big differences. So for example, on insurance, you can see that there's absolutely no evidence that we could find, whereas most of the available evidence is centered around results-based incentives. And also most of the rigorous evidence we found related to results-based incentives. So to mention a few lessons from this EGM. So as I mentioned before, like very strong lack of evidence in blended finance interventions, in particular rigorous evidence. And in the paper, we discussed some reasons for this. So for example, blended finance is inherently very complex, so there are very long value chains before the target groups are actually reached. Then there are some challenges regarding the assessment of eligibility, which also apply to other topics, but also are very prevalent in blended finance. And then what is more specific about blended finance is privacy regulations in the banking sector, which prevent a lot of the private investors or a lot of the fund managers, for example, from sharing data with evaluators or with academics to investigate this further. And the common standards and tools and measures for evaluating the interventions are still in progress, so there's still some more work that needs to be done to compare the interventions to each other. And as my last slide, so that we have some time for a Q&A, a couple more lessons. So we didn't do a heat map exactly, but we did also look at the distribution of the investments, so the data that we could find on that, and we saw that the distribution of the investments is basically contrary to the distribution of the available evidence. So for example, for results-based finance, it makes up only around 1% of the investments, but there's actually by far the most evidence for that. Whereas concessional finance makes up nearly half of blended finance interventions and is actually backed up by very little evidence. And the same also goes for insurance, hedging and junior subordinated capital, which also has very limited evidence. So there's clearly a need to look more into those types of interventions that are actually used the most. And the last point, just to give another reason for why it's so important to get more evidence on blended finance, is that also private investors are starting to look more and more for the assessment of the impact of their investments, so that they can also share those information with their shareholders, for example, and they're more and more interested in finding out what the impact actually is. So additional evidence could not only make the blended finance interventions more evidence-based, but it could also actually facilitate the mobilization of private finance. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. So now the floor is open for the discussion, and thanks, Valerie, also for starting to answer one of the questions, which I think we should focus on first, which is around the issue, what type of studies to include in an evidence gap map, and which type of study to exclude. And perhaps I'll give the floor to the panelists in a second, maybe starting with Andreas and then Milena.
I think we've lost Sven, but I think Andreas, he gave you the floor first for that question, me second, if I got it right.
Perhaps. Okay,
Just
let's do this.
decide that once he comes back in, hopefully.
Okay, let's do that. No, thanks, colleagues and friends, and thanks for the questions, of course. Look, there's very little to be said other than that's absolutely possible. It's absolutely possible to include other studies and other types of designs into an evidence gap map. So generally speaking, one has to make a very hard decision in the beginning of it, which is to set out the framework and the PICOS, and then include or exclude the criteria that the team has set out. From our perspective, in the past, what we've done is we looked at this and we tried to identify credible and strong evidence. And from a perspective of the impact evaluations, we were saying that they were far more rigorous in the identification of true impact. That's not to say that other studies are not. So we've tried to do this, and I encourage everyone to go on the website of 3IE or look for that working paper. It's called a working paper number 28 from Britta Snildhjeldt and others from 3IE, which basically describes the strategies on how to do evidence gap maps. A suggestion there is for a checklist in order to rank the strength of studies. There's options there to rank this by color. We tried to do this in the evidence gap maps for adaptation, so where we started to say, okay, non-experimental studies were from our perspective colored in a different way to just highlight that there are different study designs and different strengths with that. So it really depends the question. Let me just add one more thing just to highlight this. At the end of the day, an evidence gap map, as Sven also said, is not to tell us all about the evidence. It's just telling us where to look. So it's basically a tool to identify what evidence we got. So thanks, Sonia. I see you say thanks. Thanks. I hope I answered this a little bit. Over to you, Milena, and then Sven is back as well. So that's great.
I don't really have a lot to add to that, actually. So one thing I didn't mention when I talked about the evidence gap map that we produced is that, in fact, we did work together with 3IE, and given the name of the organization, impact evaluation is right in there. They guided us. They helped us understand what an evidence gap map is, and they tend to only include what they call impact evaluations, and that's your RCTs and your quasi-experimental. With hindsight and seeing some of the other examples, I think if we were to do this again, maybe that's not necessarily the route which we would take, and we might want to include some other studies which then give us some more of the background that we were missing in a way, because a lot of these impact evaluations that we found, yes, they did say it worked, it doesn't work, but we then struggled to work out why it worked and why it didn't work and what the sort of contexts were, and some of these studies just didn't have that. And I think we would have probably gotten that had we broadened the studies we included in the first instance on the map.
Okay, so I'm back. Apologies for that. I don't know why my internet just disappeared. Thanks for answering the question. I just wanted to add that we need to know a little bit about the history of this tool to understand a bit sort of that bias. That it was developed by Cochrane and then taken further by 3IE. So it really comes from medical research into pharmaceuticals, and there it's even still way more used than sort of in our space as evaluators or in international development cooperation and similar areas. So this is where it comes from, and that's why sort of it was developed on the basis that you would only do I guess in the beginning they were even stricter and only do RCTs and then broaden it to quasi-experimental. But what I heard also from Howard White, for instance, that at Campbell they're trying to develop this further including more qualitative methods. Basically, the challenge is how to somehow make the studies in your map comparable. I mean, this is also something what all my colleagues, Valerie, Andreas, and Milena said. You need to sort of have a way to showing the how much confidence you can place into the results. And once you solve that, and there are different ways of doing this, then it doesn't have to be limited to any kind of methodology, or perhaps just do one purely with qualitative methods. Would be interesting to see whether you find enough on perhaps contribution analysis in a certain area, So it's open there, and also I think that's another question we had from the panel in terms of what kind of intervention, what kind of outcomes. It really is on up to the team of the researchers, of the evaluators to come up with the framework that works. And I think Andreas mentioned that just when I came back, that working paper at 3IE, I think it's number 28, is really helpful. 3IE's website is definitely helpful to learn more about evidence gap maps. And Sonia, perhaps to your question on sort of how difficult it is to sell. Yeah, I mean, it takes time and resources, but considering how much some large evaluations cost, for us a relatively good pitch is that the still smaller investment into mapping out the evidence and then going strategically into those areas where they have gaps or where you can do a systematic review is in the end a far more efficient use of resources. But perhaps Milena, you want to share some thoughts about that, and also a lighter and quicker approach. Well, at least to my knowledge, be as systematic, there's not so much in terms of a shortcut that you can have, but perhaps if you spend more money, have a larger team of coders, you could try to be a bit quicker, but then there's questions about intercoder reliability. So perhaps you can share some thoughts about that, Milena.
So I think to be totally honest, we came to this a little bit blind when we decided to do a systematic review, and we probably hadn't researched enough. The thinking was there was so much going on in the European Investment Bank when it comes to climate action. Colleagues were extremely busy. We didn't want to bother them with one of the traditional evaluations where we had to, dig through their programs and ask them loads of questions. And we said, let's do something different and let's try a systematic review. And I think we assumed that we could somehow finish that within a year, and that clearly didn't happen because we were learning on the job. We were trying to understand how this is done. We I guess didn't quite realize what an army of people you need behind the scenes to code all these thousands of studies that crop up initially, and yeah, so it was really a lesson for us that we hadn't quite understood how systematic and how time consuming some of this was. But we are getting to the systematic review, so you know, a year later we've got there.
Good. Well, good luck with that. And Andreas, I mean, GCF has done many evidence gap maps. Perhaps you can share a bit, sort of also how quick you think an evidence gap map can be done, and you know, how do you sell it to your management, you know, as head of IEU? So what you know, what sort of suggestions you have there to use it, to use EGMs at an organizational level? So two questions, and perhaps Valerie can also jump in and saying a bit more about sort of how long and how complex it was or wasn't to do this EGM. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Sven. Thanks for the question again, and also to the audience, of course. Look, from our perspective, it took long because we wanted to get everyone in the team up to scratch. So we did a lot of training through CEE, a center in the UK that helped us train. And Sven from Deva, you must know, because we did partially of the training as well. We were together. So it is quite an upfront investment. So I'd say I would calculate that in, and given that, I would say it takes roughly a year and a half to do it. The quickest that we've ever done it was a year and a half, including the training. So I would say if you had people that have done it before, it could be done in around about 12 months. Just to give you a rough estimate of what we've done in the past. We've done so far 5 evidence gap maps. We do another 2 this year and next year. And so we are hoping to reach about 10. Look, and to the colleague that said, is there a lighter version? Again, I refer to this working paper, which is an excellent starting point, that tells you all about what else you could do. You don't have to do an evidence gap map if you don't want to. You could also just do an evidence inventory, which basically is just collating different evidences across different databases, and then you basically describe your research approach. You could do systematic maps, as they call it. They could be evidence gap maps, but they could also be systematic maps where you just, the approach is different. You would be snowballing on references, rather than what we try to do here is looking at a very systematic approach to look through the evidence that you've got by setting up a screening procedure, as well as very clear frameworks. I hope we made that message very clear. So just to say, and then how to sell it. Well, this is a very good question. There's only 2 things that we try to do. So one, we use this evidence as an evaluation office and an independent evaluation unit here at the Green Climate Fund. We have 2 functions. One is the accountability function, the evaluation function that we do have. And the second one is the learning function. So we also there to disseminate learning to help the fund improve their operations. So here is the task. One, we use these evidence gap maps as a precursor to evaluation. So for instance, the evidence gap map for adaptation helped us do last year's adaptation evaluation. So we use them in that way to then really go deeper into the details, into the projects, and better understand where the GCF currently is. Is it well positioned? That could be a question. But another question was also, is it doing the right things? Not only is it doing things right. And the other question to the learning for the fund, well, we are in contact with our partners and colleagues here at the GCF Secretariat, the different divisions that look at the programming of the GCF itself, and they find this as an interesting resource to tap into and just get a better understanding of how designs could look like in the future. This hasn't always worked. I'm not saying that it will always work, but it is definitely a first icebreaker for a nice conversation on what is truly learning for all of us. And let me just end by this. GCF really prides itself of being a learning organization and trying to learn from wherever it can and leapfrog from that learning into the future. And that's what we all need when we look at climate change. Thanks.
Wow, great closing remarks almost. But Valerie, just briefly from your experience, how long did it take, and how cumbersome you felt it was?
I think for us, it didn't take quite as long as other evidence gap maps, which I think was mostly just related to the fact that there were very limited evidence out there on blended finance. So it did take a long time to come up with a framework and also to come up with inclusion criteria and to identify the right studies. But the coding didn't take as long just because there wasn't much to code, to be honest. But I think where we had some difficulties in the beginning was to identify the right people who had the expertise in both blended finance and then also in systematic reviews or evidence gap maps, because it's actually quite difficult to find the overlap on those two skills. So we actually decided to work with different people for, at first, the framework, so coming up with this theory of change, coming up with the categories, coming up with inclusion criteria, and then we had other people working on the actual coding and identifying the literature. So that definitely also complicated the process a little bit. So maybe it's also something to think about how complex the topic is and how easy it is to find people who will have the expertise in both of those different skills.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Valerie. So at the